They say that if you're nervous in front of a crowd, you should imagine everyone as their 20-byte hexadecimal Ethereum address. So it's working. All right. Bonjour, je m'appelle Daniel, et aujourd'hui je voudrais parler du budget box. Hello everyone, my name is Daniel, and today I would like to talk about budget box. 22 slides of applied epistemology. So this talk is based on a paper that was written along with Aaron Fisher and Jack DuRose, two of my colleagues at Colony. It's called Decentralized Capital Allocation via Budgeting Boxes. It describes a budgeting mechanism and algorithm that we developed to give out money in a decentralized setting. Questions about funding the ecosystem are really big right now in the Ethereum blockchain space. And so this paper was a response. It was our attempt to answer that question. And this talk is going to be sort of an exposition of the ideas in the paper, but with a little bit more of a focus on the theory. I mean, you can read the paper if you want the nitty-gritty details. And this is going to be more of like a fun, big picture theory, and we'll slowly work our way towards the concrete as the talk progresses. Can everyone hear me okay? Louder? All right, I'll just speak louder. Okay. So we're going to begin with a little theory, a little information theory. And so this is my favorite result in information theory. It's called the data processing inequality. And what this basically tells us is that if we have three random variables that exist in sort of a Markov relationship, where A causes B and B causes C, then A and C are conditionally independent when you condition on B. And what that means is that everything that we know about A in C, we know through what is captured by B. Or put it yet another way, the amount of mutual information, i.e. how much C tells us about A, can never be greater than the amount of information that B tells us about A. This is called the data processing inequality, because the idea is that if you have a data set and you process it in some way, you may be making it more useful, but you're not actually increasing the information beyond what was in the original data set. And so this is like a very interesting result that comes out of information theory. And when things get kind of interesting is when we sort of take this and metaphorically understand the general task of science through this framework in which we have the world, which is this sort of complex, some would say like infinite object that we want to know about, right? We want knowledge of the world, but we cannot access the world directly. We can only access the world via our measurements. So we take measurements, we get the height of a tree, we give someone a standardized test, and we try to then take the world that is not representable and represent it in some symbolic way via measurement. And once we have that, we can then process it. We can then do analysis on the data. And that will give us something that is useful, something that we can make a decision about. And kind of if we look at the kind of the roles involved, we see that that first arrow, measurement, is really the domain of basic science. So a lot of what CERN does is measurement, right? They try to measure the physical world at increasing degrees of specificity. What educational boards do is they develop instruments to measure the aptitude of students with various degrees of success. And the challenges are representation. How do you represent the thing that you care about? And then noise. You're taking a measurement, and that measurement is going to be a mixture of some signal and some noise. And that's sort of just that's how that goes. And on the other side, we have processing, which I would say is the domain of statistics, machine learning, but more broadly. And so the challenges there are really expressiveness and complexity, right? You want your analysis to capture as much information as it can, and you also want it to be simple enough that you can execute it in a certain amount of time, right? We talk a lot of machine learning about, this algorithm doesn't scale like traveling salesman. It's an incredible analysis, but its complexity is such that it's actually very hard to put into practice. And so the people that are doing machine learning statistics are thinking about these problems. And then together, measurement and analysis, measurement and processing, we have a way to make sense of the world. I guess I call this a meaningful example, just to make it really concrete, is an average. Right? We have the world, which I represent with omega, and this is something that we care about. We take a number of different measurements of it, each one slightly different because of the inherent noise. And then we take the average and we say the average is the thing. This average is the representation of the thing I care about that I'm going to do something with. I can make a decision about it. And the point is that the average contains less information than the data set does, right? You lose information about variance, you lose all the higher level moments of the data, but it's much more useful, right? So you lose information, but you gain utility or usefulness, right? And so just to kind of underscore the point, all of our processing does not increase information. It makes information we have more useful. It turns it into a form that we can consume and make actions about. But it's not information generating, right? And so kind of where I'm driving this is, if we see that as we do analysis, we lose information, but we sort of gain actionability and we gain usefulness. If we can find better measurements, then we can actually get usefulness basically for free, right? Better measurements plus the same analysis give us in the end a result that's just more useful. It's captured more information about the world. We can make better decisions using this new result. So sort of the search for better measurements leads us to better outcomes. And that was kind of the point I wanted to drive here. But there's a little bit more. There's a little bit more to the story. I'm talking about the importance of measurement and developing better measurements, better representations, better symbols. But that's really not going to. It's not going to get us. That's not going to get us there in the end in a real way. And so these people are. Here we have Alfred Whitehead, and here we have Kurt Gödel, who were two mathematicians in the 20th century. Kind of what they did was Alfred Whitehead, along with his student Bertrand Russell, tried to really put mathematics on strong foundations. They really wanted to get mathematics, what they saw as the perfect representation of the world, the best representation of reality, to be as complete and perfect as possible. They did quite a lot of work on this. And then what Kurt Gödel did was he came along and said, actually, that's what you're doing is impossible. There's really no way that you can ever get a set of symbols that will perfectly capture the world as it is. Your set of symbols will always be incomplete. There will always be a hole or a gap that exists between the world as it is and the symbols you've chosen to assign to the world. There's always going to be a gap no matter what you do. And so, like, a lot of people know the story. I put Douglas Hofstadter here, who's a cognitive scientist who wrote a book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. In 1979, won the Pulitzer Prize. And he talks a lot about this. Most of my knowledge of this comes via him. Really like a really wonderful thinker, very deep guy. I think that the thing that happened next is really even more interesting and is going to be relevant for what happens next in this talk, was that Alfred Whitehead basically changed careers. After this thing he devoted himself to just was proven to be totally false, he then became a philosopher. And he developed a school known as process philosophy, where he basically said, you know what? I think this whole idea of representing things in a static, fixed way is like the wrong approach, because the essence of things has changed. The essence of reality has changed. He wrote a book called Process and Reality, where he basically said, we can only really think about things as being in process. Nothing is ever really fixed, and when we represent something as fixed, we're going to represent it slightly wrong. And this was his big insight. The Greeks say you never step in the same river twice. It's very much the same idea. And so I kind of made this slide, which I thought was a joke, but I think is my favorite slide of this talk. So kind of what are we striving for? Right representation, right measurement, right processing, and that will give us results that we can then use to make good decisions about the world. So that's kind of the theory, and now we're going to talk about, I guess, the information practice, how we take these ideas and we build essentially a budgeting algorithm that we think has some nice properties. Let's leave it at that. And where we begin, going back to measurements, is with what I call the minimum viable measurements, which is really just a pairwise preference. For those not familiar, a pairwise preference is really just a choice between two things, given two things, right? You can say, do I want water bottle or a phone? And I say, I want phone. And that's basically all that it is. And there's two things about this that I really like. One, it's the minimum viable measurement in a very technical sense, and that you represent it with one bit, right? There's no measurement that you can actually represent in less than that, right? There's no unit of information that's smaller than a bit. So in a sense, a pairwise preference is the smallest thing that can be represented, And also, that sort of makes it the atom, right? In a sense, you could really think of anything that as representable via pairwise preference, right? Even like a string of bits is a series of pairwise preferences, right? All the data on the internet is just a bunch of pairwise preferences, in a sense, between 0 and 1. So I really, if we're looking for the best measurement, a place to start would be with the smallest measurement. And And then the other thing that I like about the pairwise preference is that it kind of represents subjectivity in a way that I would say other measurements do not, right? And I sort of have this like really personal, irrational, like prejudice against representing subjectivity in a numeric way. Like I find like 5-point, 10-point scales, like all these scales, I don't like them. They upset me because you're taking this thing that is subjective, a feeling, and you're trying to fit it into a number, right? And you can do it, and people do it, and it works fine. It's not a bad thing. But I'm going to say that it's not really the right way to think about what's happening. And so when we measure something wrong, that noise then goes upstream through all of our analyses and means that our result is going to be a little bit less useful than it otherwise could be. And I kind of want to suggest that inasmuch as a preference between two things is subjective, right? I just want this instead of that, and we can represent that as a bit, we actually can represent something that is subjective with an objective symbol in a way that is really not as lossy, not as noisy. I feel this, I represent it this way, and we've really captured the thing in a way that I find to be like really neat. The next thing, I really like this slide just because I find typeset mathematics to be like really aesthetically pleasing. But there's also like there's a point to this slide, which is that we take all of these pairwise preferences. We just take we gather a lot of people's opinions about this or that, and then we aggregate them together. And the idea, so a semigroup is basically it's a set of objects, and there's really one rule, which is any two objects in the set can be combined together to make another object in the set, right? If you have X and Y in the set S, you can like mush them together to get Z, which is also in the set S. And if you're like, I guess in computer science terms, like reducing, this is the same thing, right? If you have a reducer, you have a bunch of items in an array, and like a reducing function, you just like reduce them all. Same concept, semigroups. And the reason why it's important here is that we have all of these pairwise preferences. We can kind of just add them together to create like a big set of preferences representing a lot of people, right? And furthermore, you can kind of scale them or tweak them to add additional information, right? So say I have all of my preferences on a variety of things, but then I have a reputation. And so all of my preferences are then scaled by my reputation, then added with others' preferences. Or you could say, I know quadratic voting is like a really popular thing in this space. You could say that every preference is then scaled by some like quadratic voting input that I'm willing to allocate amongst my various options. Or you could say, and this is the idea that I'm like the most excited about, you could even say that the longer someone has held a preference consistently, the more it retains a value, right? Like we talk about politicians always flip-flopping their decisions, but what if like the longer that I maintained this preference, the more it sort of acquired strength? And if I were to flip it, it would like reset back to zero and have to start over, right? So create like an incentive to have conviction and a slight penalty to being a flip-flopper, right? You can sort of incorporate all of this additional information and all of these additional rules into this like semigroup reducing process. And then what you get is like a set of pairwise preferences, the simplest unit of information, but like a lot of them, like a lot of information with additional information about length of time, reputation, whatever you want. So we really just have a ton of information that has been sort of accumulated. And then the next step and the last step is we throw in some like mathematical machinery to basically take all of this information and just kind of like run it through some like linear algebra magic and just like get at the end a result, And so what's happening here is that this is a very, very kind of standard set of, or classic set of techniques. We have the graph here. And I really like this graph because it's got this really beautiful motion about it. If you stare at it, you'll see it. It's like, you look at all the kind of the pairwise preferences, like who's winning and who's losing, and you kind of see like there's a motion where C is the loser, but then C gives its preference to D and B, and then D and C give its preference up to A and to B, and then B gives it all over to A, right? We take these pairwise preferences, we just kind of like turn them into a matrix, following some rules which represent sort of how likely one pair is likely to win over another, and then we take this matrix and we just take like, the technical term is like the first eigenvector. But you can think of it as running these interactions again and again and saying, okay, if this is how likely someone is to beat someone else, what's like the steady state? What is at the end, like who's going to be the winner based on these pairwise interactions? This is a technique known as spectral ranking. It's been around for a while. And this is how we take all of the data that we've just accumulated, all the information that we've gathered, and we analyze and turn it into a very simple result. And the last step, which is like kind of, I think, in a sense the simplest, but in this context, like maybe one of the more important, is we just take this distribution over the outcomes, which is really just a bunch of percentages which add to 1, and we just say that this is now a budget that we're going to use to govern our organization, right? And I have the Wittgenstein duck rabbit thing here because nothing has changed. We just see a probability distribution as a budget allocation, and then we can move forward. Like nothing really happened here. It was just like a kind of a flip of the perception. And so here we have BudgetBox, which is a simple, flexible, and powerful mechanism for measuring and processing financial priorities. And I emphasize financial, right? Those of you who are here from Atan's talk saw that in the DAO stack sense, they're taking a very general problem, which is decision-making writ large, and coming up with like quite innovative ways to accelerate that via approximation. Whereas the difference here is that we're taking a specific problem, financial decision-making, allocating budgets, which is much simpler than general decision-making, and developing a mechanism that can solve that problem, taking in more information, right? So by adding constraints, we're able to develop a specialized solution, which is not as general, but does allow for a broader-based input. So I would say that these solutions are quite complementary and orthogonal, in that they approach the same problem in slightly different ways. And so in conclusion, we talk a lot about governance in this space. When we talk about governance, we also talk about legitimacy. How is our government legitimate? And the thing that I kind of want to suggest is that by having a budgeting mechanism that can gather as much information as possible from the world, we can really get a wide set of preferences. We can incorporate a lot of arbitrary additional information into this set of into our essentially our matrix. Then we can turn that into a budget. This budget is really more legitimate than other budgets or other allocations, just because it represents and it contains so much information, right? I mean, I think that I have this like little fantasy, kind of like looking at as far as this could really go. I kind of really wonder if this is actually pulled off quite well, and like we figure out all the right knobs to tune and the right weights and the right inputs and the right questions and all that. We can actually create at the end like a data artifact, which is like it's like the source of truth, right? Like this outcome, this distribution, this budget, this is the source of truth for what we want. And that can then become the beginning of a lot of other things, right? So it's almost like the Carl Jacobi invert, always invert. Instead of the budget being the outcome of a process, it can be really the beginning of other processes, because it is the legitimate thing. This is like my dream. This is not real yet. But like thinking ahead, like that would be neat. That would be a cool thing if that happened. And so to talk about applications, there are quite a few, right? Like, we said we wrote the BudgetBox paper as a response to the problem of funding open source. And so, the first application would be funding open source, right? A lot of projects we need to choose between. We want a lot of people in a decentralized setting to be giving their input. So people perhaps have reputation. They give inputs about what projects they think they should relatively be funding. We then calculate a budget at the end. We emit amounts of funding. Another thing that we could use is people talk a lot about participatory budgeting, in municipalities and cities, right? We want people to be able to have input over how their money is spent. So we could use this for participatory budgeting, where there's this much money, all of the people in the neighborhood can give us your input, give us your input, give us your input. Organizations, so you want to say we have to allocate money between engineering, marketing, product. We can have the people in the firm make decisions about whether we should be spending money for this thing or for that thing or the other thing. Matchmaking, like finding people that you want to work with or spend time with. You can just say, I would rather spend time with this person or that person. Like a lot of things that can be put in the pairwise language we can use this technique for. And I guess sort of like the bullet points at the end. Simple measurements give us more information, which means that our analysis more closely reflects the world, which means it's more legitimate. Ease of aggregation and analysis makes it possible to update in real time, which means we can quickly incorporate new information. This is something I didn't actually mention earlier, and I should have. Remember I mentioned the sort of Kurt Gödel, Alfred Whitehead, every symbol always being complete? The way that we sort of respond to that is we say, okay, if our fixed static thing is always going to be partial, then what we need to really build in a first-class way is the ability to make change, right? We know that whatever we do will be slightly wrong, so let's build in the idea to make change. We can easily update in real time new information coming in. We can update the budget. It can always be kind of like a moving target. They can always update new information. And that means that we don't have to worry about getting it wrong. Budgeting doesn't have to be this thing that we have people do once and it takes a lot of work, and this is the budget. We really have to just like say, we have to see it out. We can come up with a budget and then start to allocate the funding, and then, oh, we realize, okay, we actually need to like move a little bit more this way. Okay, we can allocate a little bit more funding over here, maybe a little bit less over here. So it also becomes a way to provide oversight. You know, we feel like you're not really using your funding so well, so we're gonna allocate some of it over here instead of over there. It becomes a dynamic kind of moving thing instead of this like fixed thing that we have to really worry about getting right. And the last thing, you know, instead of being this thing where everyone gets in a room and like talks about line items and there's like political trade-offs and there's like horse trading, there's like, well, if you fund this, I'll fund that, you know, because only a few people can do it because it's really hard. It becomes something that's very easy. Anyone can just come in and say, I think that we should be putting our energies towards this instead of that. And then it becomes a tool for really direct oversight because it's a simple thing. So by making something simple that was previously hard, many people can participate. Which really changes the experience of budgeting from being tedious to being, I would dare to say, potentially engaging. And as I said before with the semigroups, there's a lot of ways to extend, to incorporate new information. So it really, it's quite structured, but also highly flexible, which means that there's a lot of knobs we can turn, a lot of things we can do with it. And so that's my talk. Thank you so much. And all right, I don't think we have any time for questions, unfortunately. Thank you.